Montana Territory, January 1883. The wind cut down from the Bitterroot Mountains like a blade. But it was the scream that made Barrett Crowell yank his gelding to a stop near the frozen creek. It wasn't the sound of a coyote or a cougar. It was human and desperate. He kicked his boots into the stirrups and rode hard through the pine-covered ridge. Snow cracked beneath hooves until he reached the edge of the creek, where the ice had broken in a jagged ring. A woman clung to a half-submerged log, her soaked skirts dragging her under, her lips blue. "Hold on!" he yelled, leaping off his horse. The woman's eyes locked on him, wide and wild with fear and frost. She tried to speak, but water choked her. Barrett plunged in without a second thought. The water was colder than anything he had ever felt, biting deep into bone. He grabbed her around the waist and hoisted her free of the current. She collapsed into his arms, shivering, her skin pale as snow. He carried her up the bank, both of them soaked and shaking. His horse pawed the ground anxiously. He dropped to his knees beside her. "Can you hear me?" She nodded faintly, lips trembling. "Vera." "What?" "My name," she whispered. "Vera Nolan." "I'm Barrett Crowell," he said, pulling off his coat and wrapping it around her shoulders. "You're going to be all right." She passed out in his arms. Barrett rode with her slumped against his chest, her face buried in the crook of his neck. Snow fell harder by the minute. His cabin sat 3 miles north, tucked in a clearing behind the timberline. He made it in just over an hour, teeth clenched, arms locked tight around her. Inside, he laid her on his cot and got the stove roaring. He hung her soaked clothes by the fire and wrapped her in every blanket he owned. Her body was ice. He stripped down to his long johns, climbed in beside her, and pressed close, trying to share warmth. It took hours before her shivering calmed. Somewhere in the dark, she stirred beside him. He kept his voice low. "You awake?" She gave a small nod. "Did I die?" "No, ma'am. You're still here." She was quiet a long time. Then, "I did not think anyone would come. I was just passing through," he said. "Heard you scream." Vera didn't answer. Her breathing steadied, and after a while, she slept. She woke properly the next morning, her cheeks pinked with warmth and her eyes clearer. She sat up slowly, holding the blanket to her chest. "I remember the ice breaking," she said. "I was trying to cross the creek. I thought it was solid." "You were lucky," Barrett said, handing her a cup of warm broth. "Another minute and you'd have been gone." She sipped carefully. "Thank you for saving me." He nodded once, not used to thanks. "What were you doing out there?" "I ran," Vera said quietly. "From a man. He was going to marry me. I did not want him." Barrett studied her. She looked maybe 22, maybe less. Her dark hair was tangled, her hands scratched, but her eyes were sharp, strong. "You got family?" "No. My parents died last year. I was living with an uncle, but when he tried to force the marriage, I left. I figured I could find work in Missoula, but I got turned around in the storm." Barrett sat back in the chair by the fire. "You got grit," he said. "Running off like that. Most folks would have stayed." "I would rather freeze than be owned," she said, her voice firm. He met her eyes. "I get that." Barrett had been alone for years. After the war, he rode west and never looked back. He built the cabin himself, took odd jobs when he needed coin, and didn't speak much to anyone in town. Folks called him quiet, maybe strange. He did not care. He had buried enough ghosts to know silence was safer. But Vera, she was different. Even in pain, she held her head high. She watched him with steady eyes. She did not flinch when he moved. She asked questions and she listened. By the third day, she was on her feet, helping him chop wood, cook beans, sweep the floors. She insisted on pulling her weight. "You do not have to work," Barrett told her. "I know," she said, smiling softly. "But I want to." Her smile did something to him. It stirred something he had not felt in years. One night, after snow had buried the pines and the moon hung low, they sat by the fire. Vera curled on the rug, her hair dry and clean, braided down her back. Barrett handed her a tin of coffee and sat across from her. "Why are you out here alone?" she asked. Barrett stared into the flames. "Lost someone a long time ago. Woman I was going to marry. She died in Missouri before I came west." Vera's eyes softened. "I am sorry," he shrugged. "Things went dark after that. I did not want to be around people. Did not see the point anymore." She was quiet for a moment. "And now?" He looked at her, really looked. Her eyes reflected the firelight. Her face was open, unafraid. "Now I have a reason to keep breathing," he said quietly. Vera blinked, and her lips parted. "Barrett." He reached across the space between them and took her hand. She did not pull away. Later that night, she stood by the window, the snow glowing silver behind her. Barrett came up behind her, close but not touching. "You are not alone anymore," she said. He looked at her, his voice rough. "Neither are you." She turned, and this time she reached for him. Their kiss was slow, gentle, sure. It was not rushed. It was not desperate. It felt like coming home. Barrett touched her face like he was afraid she might vanish. Vera leaned into him like she had finally found solid ground. And in that quiet cabin, with snow falling outside and firelight dancing across the walls, something changed between them. Not just survival. Not just comfort. Love. Real, steady love. And neither of them was ever going to run again. The thaw came slow that year, but the days began to lean longer, the light shifting just enough to catch in the icicles that clung stubborn to the eaves. Vera stood at the cabin's edge one morning, steam rising from her breath as she carried water from the creek, the ice now thin along the edges. Her fingers ached from the cold, but she liked the work, liked the way it felt to do something steady, something her own. Barrett had gone out early to check the trapline. He always left quiet, but he always came back. She'd grown to know his rhythm, how he moved in the mornings, how he stirred the fire with the back of a split log, how he didn't speak unless there was something worth saying. When he returned, his coat was dusted with pine needles and the scent of wood smoke clung to him. He hung 2 rabbits by the door. "Something tore up the traps," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Bear's been through. Big one." Vera glanced toward the woods. This close. Tracks were fresh. Might be hungry enough to wander near. Her stomach nodded, but she didn't show it. "I'll keep the rifle nearby." He nodded, studying her a moment. "You ever used one?" "My father taught me some. I could hit a fence post if I had to." Barrett didn't smile, but his voice softened. "We'll practice tomorrow. You ought to know more than that." She looked down at her hands. "I'd like that." Through early February they fell into a rhythm. Vera patched the seams of his shirts with thread she found in a tin under the bed. Barrett chopped wood while she stirred stew made from the rabbits he brought in. They rarely spoke about what had come before, neither sought to pry, but their silences were full of something that grew steadier each day. One afternoon, he returned from town with a parcel wrapped in brown paper. He handed it to her without explanation. Inside was a pair of woolen gloves, too large by a little but warm and sturdy. "I saw you rubbing your hands," he said. "Figured you might need them." She ran her fingers along the stitching. "You didn't have to." "I know." She didn't say anything else, but later that night, when she was folding the blankets, she left one draped over his shoulders where he sat half dozing near the fire. "I don't want to go back," she said quietly. He lifted his gaze. "Back where?" "Anywhere that's not here." Barrett didn't move, didn't speak right away. Then he said, "You don't have to." Snow melted slow that year, but each day she stepped outside, the air felt less sharp. The creek ran faster, and the birds began to return with their high, reedy calls. One morning, while Vera was hanging the last of the washed linens between 2 trees, she heard footsteps behind her. "You ever think about staying?" he asked. She turned, clothespin still in hand. I thought I already was. Barrett looked down, then back up. I mean for good. Vera held his gaze. I didn't think I had the right to hope for that. You do, he said, voice quiet. You do, Vera. She stepped toward him, slow. I would stay, she said. If you asked me. His hand brushed hers. I'm asking. And she didn't hesitate. Not this time. That night, they lay close in the cot, the wind soft through the eaves. She listened to the sound of his breathing, steady beside her. I used to think I'd never belong anywhere, she whispered. You do here, he said. She rested her head against his chest. So do you. And in the hush between winter and spring, they let themselves believe in something lasting. Something built not from rescue or gratitude, but from the quiet days that followed. From trust. From choice. From love earned and offered freely. By late March, the ground softened underfoot, and the creek ran clear and fast, its ice long broken and carried downstream. Vera stood barefoot on the porch, sleeves rolled to the elbows, rubbing linseed oil into the worn grain of the cabin's door. She liked the way her hands had grown calloused, how she could lift a full pail or split kindling without flinching. Barrett came up the slope with a coil of fencing wire slung over one shoulder. He'd spent the morning repairing the west edge of the pasture, where elk had trampled a stretch of posts during the last snow. His shirt clung damp to his back, and his face was streaked with earth. Fence'll hold through summer now, he said, setting the coil down by the porch rail. She nodded toward the field. You thinking of keeping stock? In time. Might trade in town for a few head come May. He ran a hand over his neck. You think you'd mind that? Cattle? Noise? The work? I'd like it, she said. Better than silence. He leaned against the post, watching her fingers move over the wood. You ever do carpentry before? No, she said. But I watched my father build our smokehouse. He used to say, if you can mend a fence, you can mend anything. Barrett looked at the door, then back to her. You've got a steady hand. She smiled faintly, but her eyes didn't linger. You ever think about bringing someone out here before? No, he said. Didn't see the point. Wasn't much worth sharing. Vera glanced up. And now? There's something here now I'd fight to keep. He said it without weight, like a truth he'd been carrying a while. She didn't answer, but her fingers stilled, and she reached for his. They spent the rest of the day clearing brush from behind the shed. The work was quiet, the kind that passed hours without notice. By dusk, they sat on the slope overlooking the line of trees that marked the edge of Barrett's land. The sky burned soft orange, the first stars flickering out above the hills. Do you ever miss the places you knew before? She asked. No, not anymore. I think about Missouri sometimes, she said. Not the house, just the way the air smelled in August. Like cotton and dust. He turned to her. You ever want to go back? No, she said. But I don't want to forget it either. Barrett nodded. We don't have to forget where we've been. Just don't have to live there anymore. She rested her head against his shoulder, and they stayed like that until night rose full. The next morning, Barrett hitched the wagon and rode into Missoula for seeds, nails, and a new stovepipe. Vera stayed behind, kneeling in the small patch of soil she'd turned for a garden. She planted onions, carrots, and beans in careful rows, marking each with a stone. When she finished, she stood and stretched, brushing dirt from her knees. As the sun climbed, a rider came up the trail, a narrow-shouldered man in a brown coat, hat pulled low. Vera tensed, stepping back toward the porch. The man slowed, eyes scanning the cabin, the yard, then her. You Vera Nolan? He asked. She didn't answer. He dismounted, hitching the reins to the porch rail without permission. Name's Arendab. Your uncle sent me. I don't belong to him, she said, voice flat. He wants you back. Says you ran off with things that weren't yours. Claims he's within his right to retrieve you. Vera didn't move. He's wrong. The man pulled a folded paper from his coat. Got a warrant out of Bozeman, says otherwise. She crossed her arms. I've done nothing wrong. He claims you stole a brooch, coin, a coat. Says you're unstable. I took nothing but my mother's things. And I left that coat behind. The man shrugged. A judge won't care. He's got money. You don't. Barrett rode in before the man could say more. He saw the horse, then the stranger, and dismounted in one motion. You know him? He asked Vera. He says my uncle sent him. Claims he has a warrant. Barrett stepped in front of her, his voice quiet but clear. You'll show me that paper. The man handed it over. Barrett read it once, then again. This was signed by a circuit judge who's never left Gallatin County. That's a day's ride south of where her uncle lives. The man said nothing. Barrett folded the paper and handed it back. You tell Nolan she's under my care now. She's free, and if he wants to test that, he can ride out himself. You threatening me? No. Just making sure you've got the message clear. The man glanced between them, then swung back into the saddle. You'll regret this. Barrett didn't answer. He watched until the rider disappeared down the trail. Vera exhaled slowly. He'll try again. Then we'll be ready when he does. That night, she lit the lantern while Barrett repaired the latch on the barn door. When he came inside, she was waiting by the hearth. I don't want to leave, she said. You won't. I need something more than fear keeping me here. Barrett stepped closer. What do you need? Something rooted. Something chosen. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small cloth pouch. Inside was a silver ring, plain but well-made. I bought this in town, he said. Wasn't sure if it was time. She took it gently, eyes wet. It is. He slid it onto her finger and she held his hand against her chest. Outside, the wind turned warm for the first time in months and the soil breathed open beneath the stars. The wedding took place on the first clear Sunday of April beneath a cottonwood tree just beyond the split rail fence Barrett had repaired earlier that week. Vera wore a dress she'd sewn from a bolt of faded blue calico she'd found folded at the bottom of a trunk in the loft. Her boots were scuffed but clean. Barrett had shaved, the edge of his jaw newly sharp, and he wore the same coat he'd been given when he left the army, brushed and mended but unmistakably his. A traveling preacher from the Bitterroot Valley had agreed to stop by on his way north. He didn't ask questions, just nodded once after the vows and left them with a worn Bible and a smile that reached his eyes. There were no guests, no music, no cake, but when Vera slipped her hand into Barrett's, the quiet around them felt like a kind of blessing. That evening, they sat together on the porch, a pot of coffee between them and the scent of pine pitching down from the hills. The garden rows Vera had planted were beginning to sprout, green shoots pushing through the soil. She watched them with a quiet pride. I've been thinking about building onto the cabin, Barrett said, his thumb brushing over the back of her hand. Add a second room. Maybe a root cellar. Vera nodded slowly. We'd have space for preserving. And if we ever raise anything beyond beans and rabbits. He looked at her sidelong. You mean children? I do. He didn't flinch. You'd want that someday? Her voice didn't waver. If they were raised in peace. If they had your steadiness and none of the things I ran from. Barrett's hand tightened gently around hers. Then we'll make room for that too. The days grew warmer and the work shifted with the season. Vera spent mornings tending the garden, afternoons stitching curtains from old flour sacks, and evenings helping Barrett sand and fit rough-cut boards for the cabin's new addition. He taught her how to measure flush with the grain, how to notch a beam so it held without a nail. You've got a good eye for straight lines, he said one afternoon, standing beside her as she marked a board with charcoal. Better than mine most days. I like things that stay where you put them, she said. With listens better than people ever did. He laughed, a low sound, rare and unguarded. She looked up, startled by it. You should laugh more, she said. I didn't have much reason before. They didn't talk about the man who had come asking for her. He hadn't returned, and the tension he'd left behind had faded like a bruise. But Barrett had started keeping the shotgun loaded near the door, and Vera had stopped walking the ridge trail alone. In early May, they rode into town together for the first time. The general store carried little in the way of variety salt, dried apples, flour, a few bolts of coarse cloth, but Vera noticed how folks watched them. Not with suspicion, but with the kind of curiosity reserved for people who had changed their own story. Outside the store, an older woman with a basket of eggs gave Vera a small nod. You're Crowell's wife? Vera hesitated, then said, I am. The woman handed her one of the eggs, smooth and warm. Barrett used to walk through town like a man waiting on the next blow. He doesn't carry that weight anymore. Vera tucked the egg gently into her pocket. He carries something else now. That night, Barrett leaned against the doorframe while she brewed chicory and laid out supper. The light from the setting sun reached through the windows, gold and slow. I've been sleeping deeper, he said, as if testing the words. She looked up from the bread she was slicing. I noticed. Used to be I'd wake at every sound. Couldn't help it. What changed? He watched her a long moment. I know who's beside me now. She crossed the room and stood close, her hands resting lightly on his chest. And I know where I've landed. They didn't speak again that night, not with words. But in the hush that followed, in the way she slid her hand into his and he turned toward her without hesitation, there was nothing left uncertain. In the weeks that followed, the cabin grew not just in size, but in shape and purpose. The new room took form, its walls framed and filled with the scent of pine and sawdust. Vera painted the window frame with a mix of linseed and white clay, and Barrett built a shelf above the hearth for the Bible, a small jar of dried rosemary, and the wool gloves he'd once given her. One evening, as twilight deepened into true dark, Barrett reached into the satchel he kept under the bed. He pulled out a folded map, browned at the edges, and spread it on the table. I've got land rights for the southern ridge, he said. It's rough, but there's a spring and enough flat to pasture. Vera traced the penciled lines with her finger. You want to build out that way? If we're going to raise anything livestock, children will need more than this clearing. She looked up. Then let's start clearing it this summer. He reached for her hand across the map. Together. Her answer came without pause. Always. Outside. The wind moved through the grass in long, low waves. Inside, they leaned into the future, not with fear, but with the quiet certainty of people who had already survived their worst days and knew now they had more than just a reason to keep living. They had each other, and that was enough. The lambs arrived in early June, 3 of them, wobble-legged and soft-voiced, traded from a Scotsman who raised sheep along the eastern slopes. Barrett built them a pen beside the second shed, and Vera gathered scraps of muslin to swaddle the runt when a frost hit one night, the last cold snap before summer settled in earnest. They named the smallest one Clover. By then, the second room was finished, and Vera had stitched curtains from a length of pale yellow ticking. She lined the shelf above the window with small glass jars, dried sage, cornmeal, a bit of sugar wrapped tight in waxed cloth. She had a way of making space feel like it belonged to someone, not just something. Barrett noticed it in the way his shoulders loosened at the end of the day, how he lingered longer over coffee, how he'd catch himself smiling at nothing when she passed by humming. One afternoon, when the sun sat high and the air was thick with pine pollen, Vera set a tin basin on the porch and began washing the wool they'd sheared the day before. Barrett watched from the steps. You ever work with wool before? No, but I read about it once, she said, scrubbing gently. They said if you don't wash it right, it keeps the smell of the sheep forever. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Don't mind the smell. Reminds me this land's alive. She glanced up, her sleeves soaked to the elbows. You ever think about what kind of life we're building? I think about it every morning, he said. And it never feels borrowed. It's ours. She set the basin aside and dried her hands. I want to plant fruit trees next spring. Apples, maybe a pear. Something that takes time. Barrett stood, walking over to her. Then we'll dig the holes come March. She looked at him, her gaze clear. You're sure? I've never been more. They took a trip in late summer. 3 nights and 4 days riding north to a valley Vera had once heard a peddler describe as green enough to steal your breath. They brought jerky, a little flour, and a single quilt tied around a bedroll. The trail wasn't marked, but Barrett knew how to read the slope of the land, and Vera trusted the way he moved through it. They camped by a lake the color of dusk. On the second night, under a sky so wide it seemed to hum, Vera turned to him with her knees drawn close. I used to think love meant sacrifice. Barrett waited. But this what we have it doesn't take from me. It gives. He reached for her hand, rough palm against hers. That's how I know it's right. They made love gently that night, with no rush, no hiding. Just the press of skin and breath and the kind of quiet that only comes when two people feel safe in each other's arms. When morning came, they didn't speak. They didn't have to. By harvest time, the garden had bent under the weight of its own success. Vera strung beans in loops across the rafters, and Barrett carried sacks of potatoes into the root cellar. They smoked rabbit meat and pickled turnips. When the evenings cooled, they'd sit close inside, her feet tucked under his legs, reading passages from the Bible or watching the fire burn down to coals. One night, as wind rattled the shutters, Vera leaned her head against his shoulder. I never told you, she said. But when I was a girl, I wanted to be a teacher. Barrett turned toward her. Why didn't you? There wasn't a school close enough. And the man I was promised to said it was a waste. You'd have been good at it. She smiled. There's a girl in town, Clara, the blacksmith's daughter. She's sharp. I've been teaching her letters once a week. Barrett nodded once, slow. You want to do more of that? If we built a small structure out by the road, I could teach a few of the valley children. Just part-time. The ones who can't make it to Missoula. His hand slid along her arm. Then we'll draw up the plans after frost. By the first snowfall, the lambs were near grown, the garden beds cleared and covered in straw. Vera had started baking bread once a week, the scent of yeast and flour filling the cabin. Barrett carved her a rolling pin from a fallen ash limb, and she kissed his cheek when he set it in her hands. The days shortened, the light slanting gold through the windows. They settled into winter without dread, without hunger. Just the kind of quiet that came from knowing what would come next. One evening, as snow fell steady outside and the fire crackled low, Barrett stood from his chair and knelt before her, both his hands wrapped around hers. You've given me peace I didn't know I needed, he said, and I want to spend the rest of my life giving it back to you. Vera didn't answer right away. She leaned down and pressed her forehead to his. You already have. They stayed that way a long time, firelight warming their faces as the wind sang softly against the walls. Years passed. The schoolhouse went up in the spring, a single-room place with wide windows and a bell Vera rang each morning. Children came from as far as 2 valleys over, riding in with satchels of books and lunch wrapped in cloth. She taught them to read, to count, to listen. Barrett took on a few cattle, enough to keep the land busy. He built a smokehouse from river stone and taught a neighbor's boy how to thatch a roof. They planted 2 apple trees behind the house. The first bloomed after the 3rd snowmelt. And in time, they welcomed a daughter into the world. Barrett named her Lydia after his mother. Vera sang to her in the evenings, soft hymns and prairie lullabies, and when the child laughed, Barrett swore it sounded like wine through pine. They grew old in that cabin, the beams darkening with years, the floorboards grooved by footsteps that never rushed. And when their hair turned silver and their hands curled with age, they still sat close each night, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist. They had survived the storm and built something lasting from its wreckage. Not loud, not grand, just true. And theirs. Forever.